It confused drivers, amazed crowds, and terrified passengers. Meet the Amphicar. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. And I'm here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. You know, this is a great collection of more than 180 cars. And this 1964 Amphicar 770 definitely stands out as one of the most unusual production vehicles ever built. And what a great addition to our collection. That's because it's both a car and a boat. It was developed in West Germany and produced in the early 1960s. And while this car achieved its goals, there's always a question about whether it performed either function very well. But before I dive into this Amphicar too deep, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And in the comments below, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. And since you probably don't have any personal experience with the Amphicar or Amphicar stories, I want to hear about the time you turned your car into a boat, like the time I tried to cross a flooded roadway with my RX-7 and discovered it doesn't float very well. All right, back to our story. Now, officially, this is called the Amphicar 770. That's because it's supposed to go 7 knots in the water and 70 miles an hour on land. The genius behind this was a man named Hans Trippel. And the Amphicar wasn't actually his first attempt at a boat-car combo. That was the Trippel SG6, developed back in the 1930s, and was used in limited numbers by German ground forces during World War II. In fact, Trippel was imprisoned for his wartime activities. He didn't get out until 1949, and when he did, well, he went right back to building cars. His first effort was called the Trippel SK10. About 25 were built in 1950. As the decade wore on, he built a variety of small cars. There's even a story that he was the guy who developed the gull wing doors and sold the patent to Mercedes for the spectacular 300 SL. In 1961, Hans decided to go back to his water roots and introduced the Amphicar 770. Now, this was manufactured by the Quant Group in West Germany. It's a rear-engine car with twin propellers back there that really could go on land or water. And not surprisingly, the novelty got a lot of attention. There was even one newspaper that told about how a dealer panicked people by driving directly in the water when they didn't know it was both a boat and a car. But it wasn't cheap, coming in at nearly $3,400. And when you figure a VW Beetle back then was about $1,800, well, that was a lot of money. But then no other car could do what the Amphicar achieved, double duty as both a boat and a car. Now, most of the marketing and production was aimed at the United States. And perhaps the most famous Amphicar owner was former President Lyndon Johnson, who was famous for pretending to lose control and driving into the lake to scare his passengers. Let's walk around and take a closer look at our Amphicar 770. This is a 1964 model, and in talking with Amphicar owners, they've joked that it might be better off if you just call this an Amphicar 550 because you really don't want to go over 50 miles an hour on land, and 5 knots in the water is pretty much a good speed for this thing. Now, to be honest with you, I think they did a great job styling this car. I think it looks good for 1961. I like the little eyebrows over the headlights, nice sleek side. You'll notice, of course, that there is no grille. Obviously, the engine is in the back. We'll go back there eventually. And you'll notice how hydrodynamically sleek it is. There's a tow hook down there. Once again, this aerodynamically might be a bit of a problem, but if you're not driving too fast, you shouldn't have to worry too much about lift. When you look at it from the side, you'll notice it does sit very high. It probably got a high center of gravity as a result. Wheelbase is only about 80 inches long. Total length is only about 13.5 feet. In the boating world, they talk about something called freeboard, which is the distance between the top of the water and the gunwale or the deck level. In this case, this normally has about a 20 or 21-inch gunwale. And Amphicar owners say these don't really swamp. The water doesn't come into the boat section, the people section, which is a good thing. There's a pretty famous story about 2 people in Amphicars that crossed the English Channel back in 1965. Imagine that. You know, in the English Channel where the waves and the water can get pretty high, that was a pretty impressive feat. Of course, you have the exhaust right here, mounted up very high. This is where the engine is. We'll go in there shortly. Not sure where these tail lights were sourced from. If you have a better idea, let me know. These are the outlets for the bilge pumps, so if there was any water, it could get pumped out. And then, of course, this is where the magic happens. This is where the props are located underneath. And they're just plastic props. That's the way they were designed to come from the factory. I've heard from some Amphicar owners who apparently had replaced them with metal ones. But the advantage of plastic, too, is that they can break off relatively easy in case there's a problem, so it's not a bad thing. Remember, this was 1961, so fins were still a big thing, and I like the fins, the way they've set them up right there. I think they did a great job. Simple suspension, drum brakes. They do have a habit of rusting in the rear quarter panels. There's actually two quarter panels, an inside and an outside, and sometimes water can get trapped inside. My understanding is when you do take the water afterwards, there's certain components that you need to grease up so that it's protected and re-greased. And obviously, all the gaskets and seals are critical on this. I love the navigation lights right here, our nautical horn. It's got a frunk up here, the trunk, I'll show you that in a moment. But it's great the way this thing is designed. I love the fins. Remember, there were a lot of boats back in those days that had those cool jet fins on them. So the Amphicar 770, that's the way it looks, that's the way it's designed, once again, to be both a boat and a car. By the way, I mentioned the frunk that they have on this car, a trunk up front, and this is what it looks like. You've got the gas tank up here, of course, spare life preservers, watertight compartment. I've noticed that when these are in the water, they tend to ride high on the front, but I think that makes sense. You don't want water coming over the front. The engine's heavy in the back. This is kind of light up front, so it tends to ride, with the front up just a bit. But nice little frunk area to store little extra items. Stepping into our Amphicar 770, the first thing you'll notice is there's really not a lot of room. A little bit awkward getting in. That's because the front wheel is right here and you're actually stepping over it. As I mentioned, it only has an 80-inch wheelbase, so quite frankly, there is not a lot of room once you're getting inside. But once you're inside, what you're getting is basically a standard automobile. It's more car than boat. The dashboard's laid out pretty much in a traditional form, stick shift, steering wheel, all the kinds of things you'd normally expect. You don't have a rudder, for example. But there are some pretty significant differences. Over here, we would have a pull that controls the navigation lights. Over here, we have a control for the bilge pump, so you can pump out any extra water. And this red light right here, in between the speedometer and the gas tank gauge, it shows you whether or not the props are engaged, which is really important, right? You want to know if those props are engaged. And then there's one other really important thing about this car. Down next to the gear shift is the knob, the lever you use to engage the props. Push it forward, I'm assuming you go forward, pull it back, you go back. Now, as I mentioned, there is no rudder for this car. So how do you steer it in the water? You just use the steering wheel. The front wheels literally become the rudder. Instead of having a rudder at the back, you have a rudder at the front, and believe it or not, apparently it works pretty well. You just turn it where you want to go. Obviously, it's not going to move quickly, but you turn it where you want to go, and the result is that it works relatively fine. I have talked with one owner of an Amphicar who pointed out that people who first get into an Amphicar in the water have a little bit of a problem because they're used to driving it as a car, right? You've got a gas, you've got a brake on land, but in the water, there is no brake, right? If you want to slow yourself down, if you want to stop, you simply would reach down, put it into reverse. You have to get used to the fact that when you push that brake in the water, absolutely nothing happens. I'll call this a radio delete car because as you can see, there's a little panel right there, but there is no radio in it. There is a back seat, but to be honest with you, it's pretty small. I mean, I've got the seat as, once again, as comfortable as I can be, and there's not a lot of leg room back there. But having said that, there is a back seat. This is a convertible, but it's kind of an old school style convertible in the sense that what you do is you actually have to pull this back and then you disconnect it completely from the car rather than fold it back and put it in place. So it's not something you do quickly or easily. If you're going to be doing it, you got to take it all apart and then put it all back together. So that's why I haven't taken the top off and showed you what it looks like as a convertible. I like this little warning right here. Before boating, make sure you put the bilge plug in, secure the front luggage deck, use the lower locks to seal the doors. And that's really important to point out because what happens is when you get in this car, you close the door. But if you want to go boating, down here at the back of the door is a little chrome handle. You have to put that into place. And what that does is that seals the door completely. The result is you have a waterproof compartment. I have been told that some of them leak just a little bit, but that's normally not a huge problem, especially when you got a bilge and you're not out there for a long time. But making sure that you have that little extra secondary seal in place, locked into place, is really what makes this a watertight compartment and makes it become a true floating vehicle. Uh, I've never driven one of these. I can't speak to what they're like on land. Seems like a pretty narrow track, very small. But once again, as long as you're not going too fast, although I've heard some people say that they've done 60, 70 miles an hour. But once again, I think 50 is probably a nice, comfortable speed. But imagine that. You're sitting here, you drive, you're heading towards the lake. All you do is you cruise in, keep the wheels going, engage that prop, wait for the light to come in, put it in neutral, and then off you go, sailing across the lake. By the way, if you want to go for a ride in an Amphicar, just head to Disney Springs in Orlando, Florida. Right next to a restaurant called the Boathouse, they'll sell you the opportunity to take a ride in a real Amphicar. All right, the engine for our Amphicar is right back here at the back of the vehicle. It's a 1.1 liter inline 4-cylinder engine that came from a Triumph Herald. Now, this engine was part of a family of engines that was developed by a company called Standard Triumph. They were known for producing lightweight, durable power plants for those small British cars of the late 50s and the early 60s. In the Amphicar, this engine produces about 38 to 43 horsepower. And of course, it's mounted at the rear to simplify the drivetrain layout for both land and water propulsion. It powers the rear wheels through a conventional 4-speed manual transmission for road use, while there is a separate mechanism engaging the twin propellers for water travel. You know, this dual-purpose requirement really put a lot of demands on cooling, sealing, and corrosion resistance. And while the engine itself is pretty fundamentally conventional, using it to drive an amphibious drivetrain makes it one of the most unusual mechanical systems really ever offered in a production passenger vehicle. And by the way, this same basic engine architecture was used in several Triumph models. In addition to the Herald, it also powered a wonderful little car called the Triumph Spitfire. Kind of a little more tuning and a little more performance, but the foundation was essentially the same. Of course, it is still water cooled. You can see the radiator mounted up here at just the right angle. The tricky part for all this, though, was it's in an area, an engine compartment that has to be sealed, right? You don't want the water getting in there. That's what that bilge pump is for, to make sure that there's no extra water. So getting this to work just right, getting it to have both the ability to drive the rear wheels as well as those props was not an easy thing to do, and I give them a lot of credit for pulling it off. By the way, here at the Martin Auto Museum, that Amphicar isn't our only amphibious vehicle. We also have this 2016 Water Car Panther, but that's a video for another day. During its production run, they made 3,800 Amphicars. In fact, it probably holds the record for the most amphibious vehicles built for civilians. Having said that, it really wasn't a true success. You know, it had a pretty limited market, and I mentioned that expensive price tag. And as U.S. safety regulations began to change, the Amphicar's fate was sealed. Still, you know, from an engineering perspective, the Amphicar was pretty darn impressive, simplifying the process of going from land into water and allowing at least a small number of people to enjoy the thrill and the novelty of a car that could live in two worlds. And these days, these have become pretty valuable collectibles. We saw one sell at Barrett-Jackson a few years ago for $165,000. And parts are pretty easy to get thanks to a company called Gordon Imports in Santa Fe. You know, that's pretty impressive for a vehicle that some people say really isn't a great car or a great boat. But you know what? It's just good enough to be both.